Well, I think we've got everybody on here. Bob, I'd like to say thank you for donating your time to the Deron Cherry Foundation. It's a charity that we at Integrity Truck Sales, we love to support, and we believe in it. And we feel that it's so important for us to give back to our community, and we like what Deron's doing, and we appreciate you giving your time up for that.
I'm happy to do it, and you guys make it easy. All I got to do in this case is just come downstairs, get to my home studio and connect with you guys. These Zoom situations have revolutionized everything and made it a whole lot easier. It's been a long time since I crossed paths with Deron, but I always liked him very much. You could always tell from the very beginning what a class guy he was, and he's a Kansas City icon. And one of the best things about sports, even as we grumble about some of the things about it we might not like and some of the things we take issue with, sports crosses the generations, crosses the demographics, brings people together. You can put a smile on a kid's face because kids relate to sports in a different way than adults do. So, and then that helps with charities as well. People respond to someone like Deron Cherry. And so it's a way, our involvement in sports has been a way for me and for many others to pay it forward. So that's a blessing.
Fantastic. All right. Well, and I don't know if you had any format, but we would love it if we could maybe take turns asking questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the best format and the easiest format because it requires me to prepare nothing. So there you go.
Fantastic. Did anybody want to start?
And when you do, identify yourself so I can address you by name.
Okay.
I'll start.
Oh, go ahead, Julie.
All right. I'm Julie White.
Hi, Julie.
I'm office manager here. And it's great to meet you.
Thank you.
And my question was, I was an avid, still am, watcher of the Olympics, and dabbled in radio when I was a lot younger. And I just want to know how many hours it took you to prepare before an Olympics, because you seem to know everything about everyone, and it didn't matter what country they were from or what they were doing. And
well, it involves a lot of preparation, cumulatively hundreds of hours. But one of the things I learned early on after my first couple, I was the late night host in 1988 in Seoul, Korea. Bryant Gumbel was the primetime host. Then I became the primetime host for the next 11 that NBC did. So I did a dozen all told, beginning as the primetime host in 1992. And before that Olympics in Barcelona, I spent months and months and months studying everything I could about the history of Spain, about the region of Catalonia, about every possible competitor. I was memorizing like the third best platform diver from Peru, whose name was almost certain not to be mentioned. And then it became clear to me, after I'd done a couple more, that you need to know what you don't have to know as much as what you do have to know. We have experts at each venue that are assigned to that sport and that sport alone. The host has to be a good generalist. He or she has to know the history of the Olympics, the history of the host city, and the 24 or so names and events that are likely to be on in prime time. And then if something comes up out of the blue that you couldn't anticipate, you do have to have the broadcaster's knack of being a quick study, looking at some information that you get, assimilating it in some way and making a narrative out of it. But you're resting more easy knowing that the researchers at NBC were so great, and they continue to be so great now for Mike Tirico, that if there's something you don't know, boom, boom, boom. The technology got better, even from where it was 30 years ago. It got better to the point where this information is at someone's fingertips, as long as they're adept enough to know where to find it. And then you have to be adept enough to be a quick study and use it. But I got to the point, by the end of the 90s, I got to the point where I realized I do not need to know every figure skater from Finland. If that becomes relevant, I'll take a briefing when the time comes. And that cleared my head quite a bit.
thank you.
What's been the biggest aha moment for you of your career, whether it was, good or bad?
That's a good question. I don't know if it was an aha moment, but the first World Series that I was part of the broadcast team for was 1982, the Brewers and the Cardinals in St. Louis. St. Louis is my adopted hometown. I went there almost right out of college, and that's where my career started. So it was lucky for me that the Cardinals were involved in that series because I knew all of their personnel and manager Whitey Herzog very well. And the idea, as we're about to come on the air, I was the pregame and postgame host then. Joe Garagiola and Tony Kubek were calling the games at that time for NBC, and Vin Scully came a year or two later to join Joe. But the idea, wait a minute, I'm standing here and in 10, 9, 8, I'm going to be introducing America to the World Series. And at that time, the World Series got enormous ratings. The World Series would beat any regular season NFL game handily. That World Series got ratings in the 40s. And it wasn't two big markets. It was Milwaukee and St. Louis. It wasn't the Dodgers against the Yankees. So the realization that growing up, wanting to be a sports broadcaster, but first and foremost, wanting to be involved in baseball, and that I would be not just involved, but part of the broadcast team for the World Series. I don't know that it completely eased my nerves, but I guess I thought, well, I must have put me here for a reason. And this is where I set out to be, and here I am. I'm sure I got better at it as I moved along, but that really was an aha moment. I was 30 years old. I looked like I was 15, and here I was working with Joe Garagiola and Tony Kubek and bringing the World Series on the air. So that was an aha moment.
Who was the person you interviewed who was the most surprising to you?
I was lucky enough to interview a lot of people, and again, what strikes you when you're younger has greater meaning. So when I sat down to interview Bruce Springsteen, which I did several times, that was meaningful to me, but I'm pretty much a contemporary of Bruce Springsteen. When I interviewed Paul McCartney in 1991 on the late night show I used to do after David Letterman on NBC, he had not done an American television interview in a decade. Now it seems like everybody is more accessible. You have all these shows, Inside Edition and Access Hollywood and Entertainment Tonight and whatnot. And it seems like everybody is more accessible, social media and the internet. You can get almost anything on YouTube. But then it was a really big deal that Paul McCartney sat down and we did 3 consecutive nights with Paul McCartney. And it was only mildly surprising, but a pleasant surprise, how accessible and down to earth he was. It's a big deal to be interviewing Paul McCartney. I'm sitting there thinking, I wonder if all the guys I went to high school with are watching this. And I'm thinking about sitting on the floor in the living room, my parents' living room in 1964 when the Beatles premiered on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I'm 11 years old. And now here I am talking to Paul McCartney. Those interviews came out extremely well. And a lot of people that are kind of experts on the Beatles say that that's the best Paul McCartney interview that they've ever seen, which is very gratifying to me. But part of it was because he was so down to earth. I mean, you can be famous, but then there's a different kind of fame. There's Elvis fame. There's Muhammad Ali fame. There's Beatles fame. It's off the chart, and you wonder how someone could be at the center of that kind of mania and be such a nice, down to earth person who you could converse with, sense of humor, no sense that he was being put out by this. I'd like to take a small amount of credit for it because many of my interview subjects through the years have said that they became more engaged when they realized that I wasn't just giving them boilerplate questions, that I'd done my research, that I knew something about it. So they respect you more when you have shown them enough respect to have done your homework and not to be just throwing stuff at them that they've heard 5,000 times. But mostly it was McCartney. 90% of it was McCartney. So he was a great guest. Now, there were many that kind of were disappointing. And people think the hardest interviews are the ones that are contentious. So they expect me to say something like the Vince McMahon interview on HBO more than 20 years ago, when it looked like he was going to reach across and strangle me, and sticking his finger in my face and yelling and screaming. And I didn't get intimidated by it. And that's what people take away from it. But actually, the hardest interviews are the boring interviews. I don't mind a contentious give and take. I know what I'm doing, at least I hope I do. And controversy can be a good thing. You shouldn't gin up controversy, false controversy, which happens all the time now on the debate shows like on ESPN and FS1 and on sports talk radio and on the internet. It's all heat over light. But if there's a legitimate point to be made and there's some disagreement, I don't mind that. The worst is when the person just isn't forthcoming. So now we get to the end of this long answer. And some of the people on this Zoom will not know who Jack Palance was. But Jack Palance was, Google him if you don't know, you'll see his face, you'll see his giant head that could go on Mount Rushmore, actual size. He was one of the great character actors of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and he came to late life fame by playing the trail boss in the Billy Crystal City Slickers films. So apparently he was a very laconic person who didn't like to be interviewed. But Billy Crystal and I are friendly, and Billy convinced him to do my late night show. And so he sits down and he looks around and he says in this big rumbling voice, a giant of a guy, like 6'4", very intimidating, played bad guys very frequently in the movies. He looks around and he says, "How long is this, Bob?" I said, "Well, it's a half-hour show, but that's really just 22 minutes minus the commercials." And he says, "Oh, I thought it was just 3 or 4 minutes, like Entertainment Tonight. I'm not used to this." I said, "It won't be a problem. Let's go." So it's kind of a rule of thumb. If you ask a quick jab of a question, the person tends to give a quick and relatively concise answer. I didn't want that from him because I could sense he wasn't going to be that expansive. So if he asks a broader question, maybe they'll respond in kind. So I open up and I say, "Jack, one of my favorite movies from the time I was a kid and even today is the great Western Shane, with Alan Ladd playing Shane and Van Heflin, the homesteader, Jean Arthur, his loving wife, who's also attracted to Shane, little Brandon DeWilde, who idolizes both Shane, the mysterious hired hand, and his dad. And then you play the dark gunslinger, Jack Wilson. And you don't even show up until toward the end of the film, but everybody knows something's looming. And when you show up, you're the very picture of menace. If you see Shane on the Late Show, if you're in a hotel someplace and you flick on the TV and there's Shane, what do you think 30 years later? I don't think anything at all other than I should change the channel. That's his answer. Okay, I'm not defeated. Jack, you played Mountain Rivera in Requiem for a Heavyweight, a role previously played by Marlon Brando and by Anthony Quinn. Was it intimidating to you to have to follow in their footsteps? Not at all. I didn't see their performances. I doubt that they saw mine. And it went on like this for 22 excruciating minutes. If the interview subject is a good one, 22 minutes can fly by like that. This was like an eternity. And now finally, when it's over, and so I say to him, after about 3 or 4 questions like that, I say, "You know, Jack, I'm beginning to feel the way Billy Crystal felt in City Slickers, where he's telling stories about you around the campfire and he doesn't think you're there. And then all of a sudden you walk up behind him and flick a cigar ash on the top of his head. And when he looks up sheepishly at you, you say, 'I crap bigger than you, kid. You crap bigger than me, don't you, Jack?' And he said, 'Oh, Bob, I wouldn't crap on you, perhaps on some of your questions, but not on you.' And this is how it went for 22 minutes. And then the show is over with. The lights are turned off. We're walking off the set. He throws this giant bear paw of an arm and a hand around my shoulder. And he says, 'Bob, I got to tell you a great story about Marilyn Monroe.' And I'm thinking, Jack, if you had a great story about Marilyn Monroe, why the hell didn't you tell it to me back there when it would have done us both some good? So that was the most difficult one. You know, if someone's just a pain in the ass, that's okay, as long as there's something there. But when there's nothing there, then it's a slog.
Have you ever met Elvis Presley? You brought up Elvis. Did you ever interview Elvis?
No, Elvis died in 1977, and I was only 25 years old. I've been to Graceland, but that's about as close to the king as I ever came.
Who of the other great sports analysts did you enjoy working with the most? And did you ever have the chance with Howard Cosell?
I never worked with Howard Cosell. I met Howard a few times. The first time was at the 1983 World Series in Baltimore. I had done the American League Championship Series between the Orioles and the White Sox with Tony Kubek for NBC. But in those years, NBC and ABC used to alternate. If you had the LCS that year, the other network had the World Series, then it flipped. So ABC is doing the World Series. And I just wanted to be around baseball because I loved it. So I came to game one of the World Series, and Howard is working it with Al Michaels and Earl Weaver, the former manager of the Orioles. And so Howard is standing in the doorway of the broadcast booth at the old Memorial Stadium before they moved into Camden Yards, rickety old press box at Memorial Stadium. And there's Howard Cosell brandishing a cigar about the size of a Louisville Slugger, wearing that hideous mustard yellow ABC jacket that you might remember on Keith Jackson and on Don Meredith and Frank Gifford. So there's Howard, and he's standing in the doorway. And I walk up to him, I say, Mr. Cosell, my name is Bob Costas. It's a pleasure to meet you. And he says, I know who you are. You're the child who rhapsodizes about the infield fly rule. I'm sure you'll have a fine career. And he flicked a cigar ash and walked back into the booth. And my first thought was, this is the biggest schmuck I've ever met. But that lasted for less than a second, because then I realized, no, this is great. I just got the full Howard Cosell treatment. And now here it is, 40 years later, exactly 40 years later, now that I think of it, we're in 2023, and I still have a story to tell. By and large, I admired Howard. He was keenly intelligent, and he was on the right side of a lot of issues that other broadcasters and many sports writers wouldn't come anywhere near. History has proven him to be on the right side when it came to Muhammad Ali, when it came to civil rights, and many other issues. So I give him a lot of credit for that. Plus, he drew people in. Love him or hate him, you couldn't ignore him. So he was a success. You know, Roone Arledge, who ran ABC Sports and was a genius in his own right, he didn't care that literally around the country, there were parties sometimes thrown on Monday night, and they would have an old TV that they didn't mind sacrificing, and they'd hand out bricks. And when Howard came on the screen, people that didn't like him would throw a brick at the screen to see if they could make it explode and make Howard go away. But of course, all those people had a backup TV because they wanted to watch Monday Night Football. Love him or hate him, you couldn't ignore him. So by and large, I admired him. He could be very obnoxious, though, and toward the end of his life, he was needlessly bitter and resentful of the whole business and of other broadcasters, which is a shame, because what he did on his own terms, no one else could ever match, because he was completely different from anybody else. I mean, Jim McKay was great in his own way. Vin Scully, great in his own way. Al Michaels, still great in his own way. But nobody fit the description of Howard Cosell except Howard Cosell. You know, people might say, hey, Bob, you remind me of so-and-so. No one's ever going to say to any other broadcaster, you remind me of Howard Cosell. So he was completely unique, and he should have been completely content with that. But we're all complicated, and who knows what demons might have beset him at various times in his life. But I, you know, he, you could tell he kind of liked you, actually, once you got a read on him. If he would needle you, that meant that he liked you. So when our paths crossed, he always had some little needle that he would stick in. In terms of the people I worked with, I've been really lucky. I've never worked with someone, I can honestly say, who I disliked or didn't enjoy working with. Doug Collins was fabulous on NBA broadcasts in the late 90s and the Michael Jordan era. I loved working with him. Tony Kubek for all those years on baseball. Ahmad Rashad, still a very close friend. We didn't do games together. He was the sideline guy on the NBA, and we were in the studio together on the NFL, but we always really hit it off, and we had a good chemistry. But the most enjoyable one was Bob Uecker, because he's just so damn funny. And as funny as he always has been on the air, like some 75 appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and all the Miller Lite beer commercials and the Mr. Belvedere sitcom and the Major League movies. And most of what he said on those Major League movies wasn't in the script. He just ad-libbed it himself. As funny as all that is, he's even funnier when he doesn't have to edit himself. And one of the things he would do, he was always great with me and Joe Morgan on the World Series and All-Star games and LCSs in the 90s on NBC. We just had a natural chemistry. We didn't plan anything out. Wherever the ball went, he could field it, and I could set him up for stuff. He'd send it right back. We just had a whole thing going. There was a rhythm and a pace to it that really worked. But something he did that most people are not privy to, if he liked you, and if you drop by the booth in Milwaukee, where he still does, he's 88 years old, and he still does the Brewers games on the radio, and he sounds pretty much the same as he did 20 years ago. It's a marvel. But what he'll do is, if he's got friends in the booth, there's a thing known as the cough button, which you can hit, which temporarily turns off the mic if you actually have to cough, or if you just want to ask someone a question, ask the stat man, find out what Robin Yount's lifetime batting average was, or something like that. That's what you use the cough button for. But what Uke used it for was his own brand of comedy. He would do a dual broadcast. So he'd say, well, here's Ryan Braun hitting 265, fat, overrated, they should trade him. Swinging a foul back to the screen, 0-1. So Mr. and Mrs. John Jacobs from Stevens Point, Wisconsin are at the game, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and big Brewers fans. Hit the button. 50 years together. That must be a drag, man. Here's the pitch, swinging a ground ball to short. So you do this whole parallel thing just for the amusement of his friends in the booth. And I've censored some of that too, because some of it was very, very off color. And I said to him, Uke, what if you miss the button or the wires get crossed? And this is what he says. What are they going to do? Put me in baseball jail? Who gives a bleep? Except he didn't say bleep.
Bob, I've got two for you.
Hi.
The most impressive athlete you've ever seen live. And then maybe you could settle a dispute we always have in our house with my three boys, Michael or LeBron, if you've been fortunate to see them both live.
I have. I might nominate Michael for the most impressive team sport athlete I've seen. But there's so many different ways you can look at that. Like Shohei Ohtani now is a unicorn. There's nobody who simultaneously pitched and hit at an all-star level for both. Babe Ruth was a pitcher before he essentially became an outfielder, but they didn't overlap like that. Now, does that make Shohei Ohtani as great as Willie Mays or Babe Ruth? No, but you could make a case for him depending on how you define it. Michael Jordan had a combination of greatness and charisma and presence. This is nothing against anybody else, but if their statistics were identical, Michael Jordan was still more compelling to watch than LeBron James or than Kevin Durant. Steph Curry, I think, is more entertaining to watch than LeBron James, even though LeBron James has had a greater career. If you really just look at it objectively on a computer, you put LeBron ahead of Steph Curry, but Curry's just more fun to watch. Jordan had everything. He was as handsome as a movie star. He had a kind of presence. He always came through in big moments. And the way I choose Jordan over LeBron, and that's still a raging debate. If you want to just fill airtime on a sports talk show, there's two things that will fill the hour for you. Jordan or LeBron, and the phones light up. And why isn't Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame? And the phones explode. Again, those are two reliable subjects. But the way I've answered that is this, and you can factor in my bias because during the real prime of Jordan's career, all 6 championships, the NBA was on NBC and it was a golden era. But I've always said, no little old lady ever said, Mildred, I'm sorry, I can't play bridge with you tonight. I've got to watch LeBron James. But a million little old ladies like that who didn't know a pick and roll from a three-pointer said, nope, not tonight. I'm watching Michael Jordan. They might not even have known one player on the Portland Trailblazers, but they were watching Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. And that was a decade-long epic that the American public locked into. Now, some of that is circumstantial too, because the NBA was on NBC then. So the promos are on Seinfeld and ER and Friends and Cosby and Carson and Letterman and the Today Show and Brokaw's newscast. It was just more in the cultural conversation. The NBA now is a cable product. Now, the NBA on TNT is fabulous. Barkley and Shaq and Ernie Johnson. It's fabulous the way they present it, but it's a niche. Jordan's Bulls were a huge part of the cultural conversation. You could talk to somebody who wasn't a sports fan at all, and they knew Michael Jordan. And he pushed the game forward from a marketing standpoint. The Dream Team in '92 in Barcelona, as the NBA went global. He's just the most significant figure. You know, there were others who were great for other reasons, but he's the most significant figure in the history of the NBA. I only caught Muhammad Ali toward the end of his life. I never saw any of his fights in person. I remember seeing his first fight with Frazier on closed circuit TV, and the Thriller in Manila, the third one, in 1975, I saw on closed circuit TV, but I never saw Ali up close. And he might have been, you know, as compelling gets. It's so hard when it's apples and oranges. You talk about an Olympic athlete, talk about a baseball player, a basketball player. It's difficult, but if forced to choose, I choose Jordan.
Hey, if you think about your history and all the things that you've seen in sport,
Mm-hmm.
is there one event that took place that really kind of captured your imagination or mind, or just said, wow, I can't believe this happened?
Yeah, I'll rattle them off quickly. One, I've already sort of covered. Michael Jordan, the last game against Utah, the last sequence where he single-handedly brings the team back. Scottie Pippen had a bad back. The final score is something like 87-86, and Michael has 45 points, so he scores more than half of the Bulls' points. And at the end, nobody touches the ball but him. When he steals it from Malone, he brings it up the length of the floor. And I'm saying to myself as I'm calling this, there is no way anybody else is touching this ball. They'll win or lose with Jordan. And they're down by a point. Not only does he make the shot, but he like holds the pose almost as if he's posing for a statue. And it doesn't rattle around the rim, it swishes through. If you're making a movie, you wouldn't ask for a second take. It's just perfect. And it ties a ribbon around perhaps the greatest career in NBA history. And I don't think any athlete has ever gone out on a higher note than that. I don't count the years when he came back with the Wizards. That's sort of like a footnote. Ted Williams did a home run in his last at bat, but it wasn't in the World Series. Derek Jeter got the famous walk-off hit at Yankee Stadium in his last at bat in that ballpark, but it wasn't the World Series. You know, I mean, that Jordan moment is big on my list. The opening ceremony in Beijing in 2008, I have serious misgivings about the IOC putting not one, but two Olympics in China, given its human rights record. But that opening ceremony with an unlimited budget, that's one of the reasons why authoritarian nations are appealing to the IOC. You don't have to get the agreement of the populace to say we're going to spend $10 billion on the opening ceremony or whatever the equivalent of that is. And it was just so theatrical and so beautifully staged that, you know, it just trumped any other opening ceremony I saw in all the Olympics that I covered. Muhammad Ali lighting the torch in London. I'm not in London, I'm sorry, in Atlanta in 1996 was a breathtaking moment, largely because nobody knew it was going to be him. Dick Ebersol, who ran NBC Sports, had the idea of having Muhammad be the last torchbearer. And the people at the Atlanta organizing committee, many of them said, he may be a hero to you, but here in the South, he's still a draft dodger. And Dick Ebersol said, no, you don't get it. The country has come around on that. This will really work if Muhammad is up to it. And I didn't know, and Dick Enberg, who I was co-hosting with, didn't know. Usually we get a tip-off as to who the last torchbearer would be, so we could do a little prep work and have something to say. And Dick Ebersol said, no, I want your reaction to be as spontaneous as the people in the stadium and the people watching. And it crossed my mind that maybe it could be Muhammad Ali, but I'm thinking, no, he's not up to it, because I'd seen him and I'd seen the effects of Parkinson's relatively recently. Prior to that, I didn't. So I dismissed that thought. Then I began to think, well, Evander Holyfield is from Atlanta, but maybe not quite big enough globally. Hank Aaron's from Atlanta in that sense, but that's America. It's not global. And he's not connected to the Olympics. Who could it be? So anyway, Janet Evans, the great swimmer, is the second to last torchbearer. She climbs up those steps. And the way they staged it, and almost nobody knew, they did one rehearsal at 3 o'clock in the morning, a few days before. A dozen people maybe on the planet knew it was going to be Muhammad. And he stepped literally out of the shadows. And they tell me that in the rehearsal, he dropped the torch. But somehow, like great champions do, he rose to the moment. And you could see his hand trembling. And in that moment, I think most people had this whole array of thoughts. Wait a minute. This was once perhaps the most controversial athlete on the planet. Now he's beloved. He was the most nimble and beautiful of athletes, not just good at what he did, but beautiful in the way he did it. And he was certainly vain. I'm the greatest. I'm too pretty to be a fighter. But he was willing to put himself out there. So humane, you know, to put himself out there in that condition. He was once the most talkative of athletes. And even at that point, 20 years before his death, you know, he was virtually silenced. You had to get real close to him and he'd almost whisper for you to hear him. And I think everyone in the stadium, for 2 or 3 seconds, there was nothing. It was like they were shocked. And then when it finally set in, oh my gosh, it's Muhammad Ali, then it gave way to thunderous applause. And it was exciting, but it was also poignant to see this really consequential person, not just a great athlete, but consequential in the civil rights struggle and in American history, really, to see him there in that state, but still somehow being noble and dignified and a person of consequence. That was really moving. And he said to us afterwards, because he stayed around during the Olympics and everywhere he went, like when he showed up for the basketball, Michael Jordan wasn't there, but every other great star was there. And when Muhammad walked in, he was the star of stars. They all wanted his autograph. They all wanted a picture with him. You saw these all-time great players, Karl Malone and Charles Barkley and whatnot, like they were little kids. And he remarked afterwards that he felt as if he had been born again, that this next chapter of his life began with the reception that he received that night in Atlanta. So that's one. When I think about it, talk about it, I still get goosebumps. And another one that's somewhere on that list is Kirk Gibson's pinch hit home run in 1988 in the World Series, because it was so unlikely. It was almost like a movie script. It was ridiculous. He didn't even suit up for introductions, wasn't supposed to play. It was his only at bat in the entire series. He could barely walk. And somehow he hits this home run and then limps around the bases. That one's locked in memory. So it was almost like a movie. Now, if only I could have thought of some Kansas City Chiefs moment.
Yeah.
Super Bowl IV, except you weren't there, Deron.
No.
Lenny Dawson to Otis Taylor.
Yeah.
There you go.
Down at Tulane Stadium in New
Yep.
Orleans.
Back when the Super Bowl was an afternoon game, and
Yep.
it wasn't the kind of extravaganza it is now.
Yep.
Hey, Bob.
Yo, hi.
Hey, hi, John here. Hey, I was just curious, kind of taking you back to your early childhood. I guess my question to you is, at what age did you know what you wanted to do for a career that you ended up doing, I guess?
Yeah.
Or who was your idol that inspired you to do what you're doing today? And somebody that you may have been a mentor to you or somebody that you learned from, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think I decided, or at least had an inclination when I was about 10 years old. I was smart enough to know that if I was ever going to get into Yankee Stadium without paying for a ticket, it wouldn't be to be standing where Mickey Mantle was. It would be to sitting where Mel Allen and Red Barber were calling the Yankees games. And my dad was a big time gambler. And this is before you could Google stuff, before the internet, before cable TV. So he'd have bets on lots of games that we couldn't see or hear in New York. And he would sometimes hand me the keys to the car because radio reception at night would be better in the car than in the house. And he would have me scanning the dial, and I became pretty adept at it. I knew where all the games were, baseball games and basketball games for the most part at night. And you could pick up KDKA from Pittsburgh and KMOX from St. Louis on a clear night, and WJR from Detroit. So WJR brought you Ernie Harwell and the Tigers, and KDKA brought you Bob Prince and the Pirates, and KMOX brought you Harry Carey and Jack Buck and the Cardinals, and WWE in Cleveland brought you Jimmy Dudley doing the Indians, and on and on. And so I took note of the different styles of the broadcasters and how cool it seemed to be able to describe the games that way. And those old time announcers were real stylists. They weren't just, especially on the radio, weren't just putting captions beneath the picture. They were describing the whole picture. The best of them then and even now in memory was Vin Scully when it came to baseball. And we lived for a couple of years in Southern California when I was a little kid. And I listened to Vin Scully a lot. And as I mentioned earlier, my first job out of college was in St. Louis at KMOX. So I was around Jack Pluck a lot, who in his own way was also very, very great. But I've always felt that you don't copy someone. You can learn from them and incorporate some of what they do in terms of preparation or pacing or approach. But if you consciously copy someone, you'll just be a pale imitation of the original. But I was certainly influenced by them. I was influenced by Jack Whitaker and Jim McKay later on the television side, because they were great essayists. And I think what I've done over time has come from a lot of different directions. It hasn't been just one thing: play-by-play, hosting, interviewing, essays, commentary. So it's a little of this and a little of that. So there's a lot of different influences there. But maybe the primary influence was sitting in the car trying to track my dad's bets. And then coming back, it was my first reporting job. I had to give him the news, good or bad. Yep, you just made $1,000. I'm sorry to tell you, you're down a couple of grand now. That was my assignment.
I relate back, football with Irv Cross and Jimmy the Greek, but was Jimmy the Greek ahead of his time with, I guess, gambling as far as odds and things of that nature?
Yeah, and on NBC, we had Pete Axthelm doing the same thing, but Jimmy was by far the most famous, and he had a certain, kind of Runyon-esque persona about him, but he could never talk about the line specifically. That was the edict from the NFL. So he'd say to Brent Musburger, I like the Browns big, or I like the Chiefs by a little, or I think the underdog is going to rise up in this game. It was like a wink, wink. And it's such a contrast to now, where not only do all the leagues encourage gambling, accept gambling, they're encouraging it. There's constant encouragement to gamble. And we know now that with the apps and whatnot, it isn't just gambling on the outcome. You could gamble on this possession. Did they make a first down or not? You could gamble on this at bat. Does the guy get a hit or does he make an out? Which I guess engages a lot of people, but inevitably, just the law of averages, it's going to send a lot of people swirling down a rabbit hole of addictive gambling. We know that that's part of it. It's they have to have their thing. Gambling problem, call this number. And that's their equivalent of warning. The Surgeon General has determined that smoking will do this and that to you. And I recently asked Rob Manfred in an interview, the commissioner of baseball, given all that, and given the fact that guys who use steroids and broke hallowed records are on the ballot, whether they get elected or not, but we can strongly suspect that there are players in the Hall of Fame now who might have used performance-enhancing drugs. And someday, players involved in the Houston Astros sign-stealing scandal will be on the Hall of Fame ballot. And Pete Rose is 81 years old. And no one's saying he shouldn't have been banned from baseball as a form of employment. But somebody got those 4,256 hits. How can he not be on the ballot, at least be worthy of consideration by a veterans committee or by the baseball writers, given all these changes and all these events that have taken place since he was banned back in 1989? But baseball continues to hold firm on that. And I don't think it's the best look for baseball. Justice can be tempered by mercy. In this case, look, no one's nominating Pete Rose for Citizen of the Year. But, if he was by the time it happened, 82, 83 years old and standing on the stage in Cooperstown, I think that people would kind of get it. Imperfect man who was a great baseball player. And he deserves that moment and that recognition. And I don't think that anyone would take away from that. I can't see some kid, 50 years from now walking through the Hall of Fame, holding his mom or dad's hand, looking at Pete Rose's plaque and saying, well, gee, Dad, I guess then it's okay to bet on baseball, even if you're playing baseball. I don't think that would be the takeaway, especially when one Google search could tell you that he was banned from baseball for decades and decades, lost his living. It'd be in the first paragraph of his of his obituary, I think that's penalty enough.
Hey, Bob, I always wondered about that, with baseball and in other sports where it takes them so long to recognize people. I remember Buck O'Neill,
Yep.
they
Kansas
could have
City.
honored, they could have honored Buck O'Neill in the Baseball Hall of Fame while he was alive, but they wound up waiting until he passed away before they gave him that honor. They needed to give him that honor while he was alive.
They
And
sure
that's
did.
unfortunate. The other thing I was going to ask you about baseball, the viewership has gone down. The game has slowed down tremendously over the years. I was a big baseball player growing up, and my dad umpired baseball for like 35 years. So I grew up with the game and loved the game. But as the years gone by, I've kind of gotten away from it. And I'm wondering if there are any changes that you think that baseball could implement that would make the game a lot more entertaining for the fans and people who, just don't watch it anymore because it's just not the entertaining product that the NFL is.
I've been saying this for years. Baseball's supposed to have a pleasing, leisurely pace. It's not supposed to have a plodding, lethargic pace, which it too often has had in recent years. The same game with the same basic score used to take 2.5 hours, and sometimes now it takes closer to 4. One of the advantages that timed sports have is that, let's say you turn on a football game and it's the third quarter, and there's 7 minutes to go in the third quarter. You got a pretty good idea of how much time you have to invest to the end of this game. With baseball, there's no assurance of that. You turn on a game in the 6th inning, even with the ghost runner on second base, if they go to extra innings now, you have no idea how long this might take. So they're aware of it, and they have instituted changes for next year. There's going to be a pitch clock, something like 15 seconds with no one on base, and 19 seconds with someone on base. And if you don't deliver the pitch, it'll be called a ball, automatic ball. So they hope that'll incentivize things to move along. They've outlawed the shifts. So you have to have 2 infielders on either side of second base, starting with this coming season, which they think will create more base hits and therefore more action. They've also done something that seems a little weird, but they've enlarged the size of the bases. So when you enlarge the base by a few inches on either side, that means that the lead that the guy on first base gets is a little bit closer to second base. And if he tries to steal second base, that side of that bag is a little bit closer to him. And if you're thinking about a close play, that's the difference between being out and being safe. The stolen base, which is one of the most exciting plays. Think of the Cardinals of the 1980s under Whitey Herzog, who used to manage the Royals. They ran other teams into the ground. They might not hit 100 home runs as a team in a season, but Vince Coleman stole 100 bases, and Ozzie Smith stole 50 more, and Willie McGee stole 45, and they made other teams crazy running the bases. They want to bring more of that back into the game. So they think that might further incentivize people to take the risk of a stolen base. They're aware of all of it. We'll see what happens. You're right that attendance in baseball overall is higher than it was when we were kids. And regional ratings, the Cardinals around St. Louis, or the Yankees on Yes Network, or the Red Sox on NESN in New England are very high, but on a national basis, it doesn't rate like it used to. World Series ratings are anemic alongside what they were in past decades. So we'll see if some of these changes help, because it's a shame when you look around, there's so many great young players. You got Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani on the same team. You got Aaron Judge hitting 62 home runs. You got Bryce Harper in Philadelphia. There's so many terrific young players in the game. Yordan Alvarez in Houston, guys who are really interesting and entertaining to watch. And I hope that some of these changes make it more appealing overall. And regarding Buck O'Neill, they put together a committee to study the Negro Leagues. The obvious ones, Cool Papa Bell and Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and Oscar Charleston were already in. But they said, let's go back and make sure we haven't overlooked anybody. And they put 14 people in, and one of them wasn't Buck O'Neill. Like, what the hell was this committee thinking? And to show you what a great guy, you know this, Deron, what a great person Buck was. He was hurt by it, but he was too decent to complain about it. And he actually stood on the stage in Cooperstown and spoke on behalf of the new inductees, almost all of whom had passed away. That's how much bigger he was than the committee that was too small to recognize the overall contribution he made. They just looked at statistics and they said, well, he was a good player, but not a great player. Yeah, but he's a great figure in the history of the game. And then the hall was embarrassed. And so they created an award in his name, the Buck O'Neill Award. And there's a statue of him in Cooperstown. And then eventually he was inducted, but it was posthumous. So that was a shame.
I just want to know, you know, when, if you retire, ever give it up and walk away, what do you want everybody to remember most about you as a broadcaster?
That I brought a little information and entertainment to the audience. And maybe that I was versatile enough that I didn't fit any one category. I did things both in sports primarily, but also outside sports. And I hope that I brought an element of journalism to it and an element of commentary, but at the same time, some sense of joy about the shared experience. I think that it's a little harder to do that after you've been around a long, long time. But certainly through most of my career, I hope people could sense that I was at least as thrilled to be there as they would be to be there. I hope I projected some of that, and I hope that they got a positive feeling about me personally. But in this business, nobody bats 1,000. Social media, you know, name any person in history. If Lincoln were alive today, social media would crush him. You know, if Vin Scully or Jim McKay were starting their careers today, some lunatics on social media would crush them. There are no misdemeanors in social media, only capital offenses. So there's a mean-spirited tone there. It affects our politics and it affects almost everything. But I hope that level-headed people have an appreciative view. At least that's what I would hope. But if it's on my tombstone, I won't be around to check, so it won't make any difference.
Hey, Bob, let me just say this. I think as a former player and a guy that's been around the league and been around you at Pro Bowls in Hawaii when you guys would do the Battle of the Stars or whatever. And I think watching you and listening to you over the years, you've treated everybody with the same respect and fairness that players deserve out of people that are in your position. And I wanted to say that to you because I think it's important in this day and age where people are trying to get an edge on somebody or say things and it's, you know, talking above the fray. You always exhibited a sense of respect for the guys that were playing the game. And I think, you know, to me, that's a great compliment to you.
Thank you.
Your style and your longevity in broadcasting so many different sports, you know, football, baseball, basketball, the Olympics, everything. So I just want to commend you for what you've done and how you've represented yourself over the years.
Deron, that means a great deal to me. And that actually is one of the things I should have cited. If people think you're fair, and you can be fair without fawning, you can be critical without being harsh. You know, I try to be balanced and I try to give everybody a fair shake. So if that's come across, then I really appreciate that.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate and am honored to have this opportunity to visit with you and hang out, you know, so thank you for that.
I enjoyed it very much. You don't have the clock ticking in your head like you do when you're on the air, so I could be more expansive. I hope I didn't bore anybody, but I appreciate the chance to talk with you guys.
Well, actually, I'm hoping that you'll give us that opportunity to put it in our auction again, Bob. This has been wonderful, and I'm sure that there's somebody else that would love to have had the opportunity to sit down and spend an hour and listen to your stories. I could listen to you all day because I know we heard a few stories, but I'm sure there's a lot more. So thank you on behalf of my foundation. I appreciate you donating your time for us. Marty, I appreciate you setting this up for us. Marty's been a true champion of our foundation here in Kansas City. And I'm just so thankful to have relationships with people like Marty. And Kirk, who bought this package, is my brother-in-law, Bob, and we're married to sisters. So Kirk,
So you
I
had an in.
appreciate you and all your folks there and people who are on. Thank you so much for all your support for our foundation and what we do here in Kansas City to help serve those who need it the most. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Deron. You know, one of the things about being in sports, and I'll close on this note, there are a lot of doctors in my family, in-laws, cousins, and whatnot. And I often say to them, you know, what you do is so much more important than what I do. But when you go to the grocery store, no one says, hey, great job on that surgery. You saved that guy's life. But one of the perks for us is that people recognize it. And so we get that appreciation. We get that feeling from it. But also being involved in sports, because it cuts across generational lines and demographic lines, it gives you a chance to pay it forward because of people's interest, especially with kids. A kid lights up in a way, you know, when in the early 90s, I had a chance to leave NBC and go to CBS and be on 60 Minutes. And one of the reasons I didn't take that offer, as prestigious as it was my kids then were 7 and 4. You can't say to a kid, I'm going to interview the Secretary of State. You want to come with me? But you can say, hey, let's go watch the Bulls and we'll see Michael Jordan. Or let's go to the Cardinal game and we'll see Ozzie Smith. So sports gives us a chance to pay it forward in so many ways, just like you're doing, Deron. So thanks for having me.